Okay, this is the introductory video to our new time period. This goes along with the video on contextualization. And our focus in this video is the 1450 to 1750 time period, also known as the early modern age. If you haven't picked up on this yet, world history is not only divided into units of study, but ultimately time periods. And it's going to be these time periods that provide the events, the developments, and the processes that define the context for the individual things that we study within it. As you know, we just got done with the global tapestry period from 1200 to 1450. And we not only saw that there was a common political development across the world, but we also saw Afro Eurasia become connected in interregional trade. Well, after the events leading up to 1450, this is going to change. And so ultimately, by watching this video, we want to be able to understand the things that define the early modern age as an era in world history, so that when we talk about land empires, the development of religion, or even the age of exploration, we can contextualize them within this time period. So ultimately, what I'm going to be teaching to you and what you need to take notes on is specific characteristics of the early modern age. This includes dates and major developments. We also need to connect it to our past knowledge. We want to be able to find the things that are changing and remaining the same from 1200 to 1450. Most importantly, we're going to see a second intensification of exchanges. And we're also going to see the building and the maintenance of new states. So ultimately, what you're going to need to be able to do by the end of this video is you're going to be able to define what the early modern age is as an era in world history. In other words, what are the characteristics that define this age and make it different from, say, the global tapestry period? So we begin with the dates, and these are dates you're going to need to know. 1450 to 1750. Even though this time period is relatively short, 300 years, we see some of the most important developments and changes, along with the very big events that are going to go a long way to defining world history as we know it today. The main thing is the world becomes connected in a global network of exchange. And that global network of exchange features the global flow of silver to buy commodities and bring them in to make money. Europe is going to be the main drivers of this new network, but they're going to reach out and create trading relations with Mughal India, Ming China, Japan, and Sub-Saharan Africa through their takeover of the Americas. So this time period is going to be split into two units of study. The first one is basically our study of land empires. Unit 3, understanding how land empires and things that we call nation states, how they developed and how they consolidated their powers. In the next unit, transoceanic interconnections, that would be Unit 4, we're dealing with the same time period, but now we're looking at how they interacted in this new global network of exchange and the effects that the global network of exchange had. So when we begin to get into this, the early modern age represents the end of what we consider to be the ancient and the foundation of the same processes that we use today. So the first thing that we're going to kind of get into here in just a second is new models of empire. We have not only land empires, which replace the fallen land empires such as the Mughal, the Mongols, and the Chinese, but now we have new empires called maritime empires that are linked through maritime trade routes. Secondly, this is when we begin to see the steps toward globalization. The world is beginning to come together through the connecting of the eastern and the western hemispheres, which results in deeper, wider, and more consistent exchanges. There's a lot of biodiversity and biological transfers during this time period. We have the worldwide transfer of plants, animals, and some diseases, which are going to be used across the world and create changes not only in population, but also in how people live. And finally, we see a lot of diversity. We see new cultures develop. We see new ethnicities kind of blending their culture with the culture of other people to create new ideas. So, when we talk about what led up to this, why do we choose 1450 as the start of this time period? We really need to focus on the collapse of the global tapestry. We know that there was a fairly significant change in weather called the Little Ice Age, which is going to drastically reduce agricultural productions, leading to the unhealthiness and a lack of food. This also leads to the beginning of the slowdown of Afro-Eurasian overland trade. Well, then comes the Black Death, and the Black Death finishes the work of the Little Ice Age, pretty much not only ending Afro-Eurasian overland trade, but also making the states that we saw develop, such as the Mongols and the trading states in India and the trading states in Africa, collapse. This collapse provides us a transition because we know that political organization under empires is coming back, and we also know trade's going to come back. So ultimately, the effect of it was the end of the Silk Road. Now, there's still going to be some overland trade, but the long connection between China and the West, well, that becomes more maritime. And things shift to more maritime trade through the Indian Ocean system because India was not that drastically affected by the plague, though we do see the collapse of certain trading states because of the lack of demand. So we, in its place, in this gigantic power vacuum, we see new empires. A power vacuum is going to exist in Afro-Eurasia. The old states, such as the Mongol Khanites and the trading states, and even the smaller states that are developing in Europe, they're all going to collapse. And they collapse because they essentially cannot provide for their populations. So these new states that are going to develop, categorized as either nation states or land empires, they're going to learn that the connections of the past in terms of trade were very important for bringing in gold. If you were able to bring in gold and luxury goods, then your population was more likely to be happy, supportive, and able to pay the taxes that you needed to have to run your government. Secondly, we see this big rash of innovation, which is going to allow for new empires to be built. The most important being gunpowder and the weapons that resulted from its use, but also new ship designs, new innovations in maritime trade, which allow for trade across the water, which is much safer and much cheaper to be able to take place. So, to kind of sum up what we're talking about, because of the events of 1450 and the collapse of the tapestry due to the Black Death and the Little Ice Age, new states come in. And new states reach to the past knowing that providing for their population through gold and luxury goods is important for their loyalty, but they also develop new innovations to allow them to build these empires. So, what we have is we have land empires, larger geographical areas ruled by a core state that were built using gunpowder and connected by land routes. These were mostly built in Asia, replacing the old Mongol Khanites. And they become wealthy or attempt to become wealthy through the production of luxury goods. This includes Russia, the Ottoman Empire, the Safavid Empire, the Mughal Empire, and Ming and Qing China. Now, we also have maritime empires. Now, maritime empires grow from nation states. In Europe, after the Black Death, the new political units become nations, areas ruled by a sovereign king made up of people of a common cultural heritage that use borders to define their area of rule. Well, in an attempt for these nation states to become economically successful and to be able to help their population through wealth and providing luxury goods, they create maritime empires. These are larger geographic areas ruled by a European core state, also known as a nation state, who use gunpowder and maritime innovations to build their empires. Now, both of these empires, land and maritime empires, are going to be built for economic reasons. And these maritime empires took the form of what we call colonial empires, meaning colonies in the Western Hemisphere, and establishing trading posts in the Eastern Hemisphere. So these included the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the French, and the English. So what we're dealing with here is we're dealing with how certain groups of people, such as the people in Asia building land empires, or the people in Europe building nation states that lead to maritime empires, they're basically interacting in the world. And they are both the creators and the operators of the world network of trade that emerges between 1450 and 1750. So now that we've kind of set the stage and contextualized what's going on, let's go through the specific characteristics. Number one, we have larger empires. These empires were bigger, ruling a much more diverse population over greater distances. These empires were built using gunpowder weapons, and they consolidated and legitimized their rule through a very elite bureaucracy, innovative uses of taxation, the use of a professional military, including a navy, and also the use of religion, art, and architecture to legitimize their rule. So both land empires and nation states that become these maritime empires, they do this. Now, when we kind of look at what their goals are, is their main goal is going to remain economic. They're going to be bringing in gold. They're going to be bringing in luxury goods to promote the lives of the people that they rule. The second big thing that defines the early modern age is going to be continued technological development. Now, the one thing that I want you to pay attention to here is that these are somewhat continuities, meaning that the people of the early modern age took old technology, such as gunpowder, and essentially made it better, more efficient. So one would be definitely gunpowder weapons. On the left, you see a Chinese, what basically, it's supposed to be rockets, but let's face it, it's the fireworks that we have today, all the way to these huge cannons, and also eventually to firearms. Both nation states that build maritime empires and land empires are using these gunpowder weapons to expand. Now, another continued technology was the maritime technology that we saw develop during the global tapestry. On the left, you see an astrolabe in the upper left, a magnetic compass in the upper right. We see a dhow boat in the lower left, and we see a junk boat in the lower right. Those are all technologies that emerged during the global tapestry. Well, what happens is Europe learns these technologies and they begin to make them better. So we have a whole package of navigation that uses the astrolabe, a new thing called the sextant, the magnetic compass, and portalon charts to be able to tell where you are in the world when you're in the middle of the ocean. And also the triangular lateen sail of the Dow boat, the stern mounted rudder, and the design of the junk boat all go into making new ships that can travel across the ocean, such as the Caravel on the top and the Dutch Flute on the bottom. So, this continued technological development allows trade and people to travel further and to bring in new areas, such as the Americas, into this new network. Another continued technological development is basically knowledge of the working of the winds and the seas. We know that in Unit 1 and Unit 2, that the people that sailed on the Indian Ocean system had knowledge of the monsoon, and these monsoons basically would push you east or west depending upon the time of year. So you can harness that and plan your journeys. Now, this knowledge turned into what's known as the Volta del Mar. What the Europeans realized is that instead of simply east-west winds, that the wind patterns and the current patterns of the world were actually circular. And you could use them to travel year-round at any time of the year to make sure that you got to where you needed to go. Again, taking old technology and making it better. We also begin to see the use of the printing press and the mass production of books. Now, effect number 3, or characteristic number 3, is going to be the massive biodiversity. This is a picture of what's called the Columbian Exchange. And a vast majority of the foods that we live off on a daily basis are a result from this. So when you look at the upper arrow that points from the Americas to Europe, plants that were native to the Americas, such as corn, tomatoes, potatoes, turkeys, pumpkins, and things like that, they are now transferred by seed into not only Europe but Asia to add to the food supply and feed a growing population. Because remember, we're still in the little ice age. So this actually allows for greater food supplies to be developed. Now, in the Americas, things such as honeybees, sugarcane, bananas, grapes, and other things are transferred to similar geographic areas in terms of climate in the Americas, and this also adds to the food supply there. Additionally, livestock such as cattle, sheep, and pigs, and horses, and other things travel from the old world to the new world. This biodiversity adds not only more food to the diet, but also adds other diseases. Now, one of the effects of this new biodiversity is we're going to begin to see a population explosion. So you see about 1400, you see a little bump to about 1500, and then it slowly begins to climb to 1600. And right at 1750, we see a much greater world population represented by the black line. And also urbanization is recovering from the Black Death. The fourth effect or characteristic would be global trade, meaning that there was a global flow of luxury goods and commodities coming out of Asia and the Americas, and the global flow of silver to pay for it. We also see the global flow of slaves going out of sub-Saharan Africa, mostly into the New World, but also into certain areas of Asia, along with the migration of Chinese into the spice plantations of Indonesia. So this global trade was gigantic, and it was basically driven by the silver that was found in the Americas. As you can see by this map, you see the two greatest silver deposits, one in Mexico and one called Potosi in South America, providing vast amounts of silver that are taking a little bit into Europe to pay the merchants, but a majority goes into Mughal India, the Indies, and in China. Also, Japan, a secondary provider of silver, really helps us out. The silver would be the global flow of wealth that pays for this. This leads to what we call the commercial and the price revolution. What we mean by commercial revolution, it's the ultimate form of specialization, where more workers specialize in one thing and use that income to buy the things they need. So we're transitioning to more of a modern economy based limitedly on what we're going to call capitalism. And the price revolution essentially would be the steady increase of price, basically due to demand. Now, we also see a very big negative during this time period because everything produced is going to be naturally grown or come from nature. We see the use of coerced or forced labor. The most prominent one was chattel slavery. Okay. We also see indentured servitude, a system called the encomienda, and the Spanish adopt the Midas system. All of this provides the labor needed to produce the cash crops and other things that are needed to trade, and also mine the silver. Now, the fifth effect or the fifth defining characteristic is going to be cultural diffusion, and we're going to see a great deal of syncretism. We see changes and reforms in existing religions. Sufism takes off, Sikhism develops in India, and the Christian church splits in Europe. We also see synced religions such as Voodoo, which is voodoo, and a little bit of Sikhism. Essentially, we see a lot of new religious development, cultural development. The last effect or the last defining characteristic is going to be new social hierarchies and new elites. Essentially, what we have is we are now becoming integrated with people of other cultures. So, what can we do to make sure that the cultures that are the conquering cultures remain dominant, but incorporate those others into the culture to take advantage of their production? Excuse me, I stumbled over my words there. What you see in these pictures is called the Spanish casta system. So, to end this, at the beginning, I told you that I wanted to teach you what defines the early modern age as an era in world history. Well, key things to remember that define it. Number one, because of what happens in 1450, new empires emerge because of the collapse of the Mongols, and they use new innovations such as gunpowder and naval technology to build their empires. New empires were either land empires or they started off as nation states and built maritime empires. These empires were bigger and they were much more diverse, and they used technology to build them. So you're going to see a lot of technological diffusion into Europe that they take and they make better to build their maritime empires. We see larger biodiversity occurring in the form of the transfer of foods, animals, and diseases, which are going to lead to a population explosion by 1750. Global exchanges emerged based on the flow of silver and the commercial revolution, and we see religious schisms or splits and syncretism emerge. And finally, new social hierarchies and elites emerged. So the only thing left is to explain why we choose 1750 to end this time period. And the reason is by 1750, the world has been connected in this great network of exchange, and that land empires begin to assert their dominance over, maritime empires begin to assert their dominance and dominate the world.